Hey, what is up guys, this is Eli for MOBOXgraphics.com, and this time we are going to keep it sweet and simple. We are going to model this low poly town in Cinema 4D. If you don't feel like watching the whole video and you just want to take a look at the project file, you can find it on the Patreon page, but for everyone else we will just get started with the tutorial. So the first thing we can do is creating this base or the floor. So that will be a cube object. And it all depends on your taste, but I'm going to make this the rough size of something like 900 by 25 centimeters, so that's the thickness, and 600 centimeters on the z-axis. So that gives us something like this. I'm also going to add a fillet to this to make it just a bit softer, but right now it's a bit too soft, so let's decrease the radius of this. I think something like 5 looks fine. Okay, so the next thing we can do is creating the roads inside of this cube. So the easiest way to get the best result for my liking is creating yet another cube object. And I'm going to make this something like 40 centimeters. I think that's a good size for our road. So let's just drag this somewhere where I want the main road to be. So I think that's here. The easiest way to build some roads now is actually making this editable already. And we are going in the polygon mode, so we can select one side. And I'm just going to stretch this to the point where I want to have an intersection with another road. So let's go to something like this. And here I want an intersection. So what I will do now is creating a duplicate. So you can do that by holding Command or Control and dragging it to the side. And I'm also going to hold Shift so I can move it by increments of 10 centimeters. And I'm going to stop at 40 centimeters. So I have a perfect square at this spot. So let's make yet another duplicate all the way to the end. Also make sure it overlaps so it covers the whole cube at the bottom. And I'm going to do the same thing at the other side. Okay, so now we have these two squares right here. So what I'm going to do now is selecting these two polygons at the side and duplicating these to the back. Something like this will do. Now we need to create yet another duplicate of 40 centimeters. And that way we should be able to connect these two polygons. So you can do that by selecting both of them and right click and select the bridge tool. Now you can click and drag from one point or corner to the other and release, and that should give you a nice connection of the polygons. So now these are very square at the corners, so maybe we want some rounding on this. What we can do is going in the edge mode, and I'm going to select these edges at the corner. And when you've got all of them selected, you can right click and select the bevel tool. And we are going to make a bevel by clicking and dragging. So I think something like a 30 centimeters looks fine. But we are also going to up the subdivisions, so it is rounder. I think something like 5 subdivisions does the job. And we're also going to check limit so we don't have this intersection right here. Okay, so that looks nice now. But you can see the road is actually floating above the floor, but we want it to be engraved in the floor. So what we need to do now is creating a bool object and dragging both of these cubes inside of it. Right now you can see there is some strange stuff going on. But it is because we need to make sure the order of the cubes is correct. So let's drag the bottom one above the upper one. And now you can see the cut is made. So one more thing we need to do is raising this road so it isn't going all the way through the floor. Something like this will do. In my case this looks pretty clean except for all the lines, but you should just ignore that for a visual model like this one. If this was for a game this would be very problematic. But if we render, you can see there is nothing of these lines visible, so let's just ignore that. But as I said, if you have some glitches or stuff, maybe at this point, you should go in the bool settings and disable the high quality option. That way it should be fixed. But also if it works fine, you can keep the high quality turned on and also select hide new edges. That way it looks just a bit cleaner on your scene. Okay, great, so this is a good point to get started with creating a house. We are going to make 4 variations, but I'm not going into detail on all 4 of them. I'm just going to show you how one house can be built, and all the other ones will use just the same techniques. So let's get started with the most simple house, and that's by creating yet another cube. And the size can be anything you like. but I found a good size is somewhere between the 60 and the 40 centimeters, so that's close to the size of the road actually. So I think this is good for one house. So now what we are going to do is making sure we are in the garage shading lines mode on the display setting. That way you can see all the lines at the edges. And that is because I want to create one more segment at the middle of this cube. So let's take a look at what direction we want this. It appears to be on the Z-axis for this one. And we're doing this because now we can make this editable and select this upper edge and raise it up. So that way we have some kind of roof shape. Okay, next up we can create the door and the windows. So these will be just some other cubes again. We need to scale this down, of course. So let's get started with the door. And you can already think of this in a way where we will be using the bool object again. So when we have this door, you can see it is inside of this house. So we need to move it back a bit so it only cuts out this portion you can see very slightly. So this will be the door. Let's create some windows. It's just the same thing. You can even copy and paste these cubes. And let's also add these on the other sides. Okay, so when you're done with placing the windows, you can group all of these windows together by selecting them and pressing Alt and G. And now we're going to create yet another bool object, so we can drag both of these inside of it and also make sure the order is correct again. This way you should have something that looks like this. So now I would like to have some more detail on this roof, because it's just a bit too simple right now. We're going to select the house, of course. And let's go in the polygon mode so we can select both of these pieces. And usually I would start making extrusions on this so we get a nice shape. But for this one I think it's easier if we split these polygons from the object. So it is easier to apply the materials on this later on, because we will be having a separate object where we can drag the material on, instead of having to select all the separate polygons on this building and making sure all the textures are not intersecting with each other. If that's not clear to you, you will see what I mean when we are going to apply the materials. But for now, let's split these polygons from the actual house. So with these polygons selected, right click, and somewhere at the bottom there should be the option split. When you click this, you can see we have a new object. But the one that is highlighted is still the original object. So in this case, what we can do is just hitting delete or backspace. And that way we get rid of the selection at the top here, which was the roof. So that way we only keep the bottom part of the house. So the other object is the one with the roof. But right now you can't see it because we have the bool object still selected. So let's make sure that is disabled. You may be wondering why we need to disable the bool object. Because a bool object only makes a cut between the two first objects, and it is ignoring all these windows and cubes inside of this group. So what we can do already to fix this is selecting these two top cubes, so that's the building and the roof, and let's group these together again by pressing Alt and G. I made this extrusion just to show you it is there. I'm just going to undo this quickly. So now with that bottom object selected, so we have the roof, and making sure the polygons are also selected, we're going to press I on the keyboard to get the inner extrude tool, and we're going to make a small extrusion. Something like 2 centimeters will be good enough. Also make sure you add this minus before it, because otherwise it will go inside of the roof instead of outside. Now we can press D on the keyboard for the extrude tool and make a small extrusion to give it some more thickness. So I think something like 1.5 centimeters looks just fine for this. So that's the roof. One more thing I would like to add to this is a window at the top here. So let's get started with yet another cube and scale this down. And basically we are going to repeat just the same steps as we did with the shape of the house. So what we need to do now is selecting this cube and adding a segment on the x-axis in this case. So we have a cut straight through it. Make it editable, select this middle edge and raise it up. Also make sure it connects with the actual roof at this part. Now we are going to split this roof and hit delete to get rid of the duplicates. Select the bottom cube and select the polygons as well. And we're going to make a small extrusion. This one can be a bit smaller than the actual roof, because it's also a smaller object. And then make an extrusion upwards. You may see this growing outside of the actual roof, so let's just adjust the position of this. So one more thing we need to do now is dragging this under the group of the house, so that's this group. And now we can just duplicate one of these cubes we had originally and make a cut at the window. So that is one simple house. So we can call this house number 1. This is the basic technique for creating these because it's a very simple style. I'm going to create 3 different houses now. You can still follow along with the time lapse I'm going to show you, but I think it's a good thing to get creative, so make something nice of it. Okay, I hope you managed to come up with something nice looking. So now as a next step we would like to create more of these, which are scattered around the floor. You could do this by just making duplicates of all these 4 houses we created, but that is not the best option because when we do this and we want to create an adjustment to one of the houses, it would not copy to all the other ones, so we would manually need to do this on every copy of that house. So a better way to do this is creating an instance. So that's at the same menu as the bool object and just below it. And with this selected, you have this reference object field. So what you need to do now is just dragging the house inside of it and you're done. So let's create 3 more of these instances to start with. So we can drag the house in each one of them. And this way we can also move these houses below the floor so they are hidden. We only need the instances. What we are going to do now is selecting all of them and making sure they hit the floor. And now we can start moving these around the scene. Okay, when that is done, we can start with adding some details to this. I think a nice thing to do is adding some fences between the houses so it's more separated from each other. So that are just some cubes, which are very small and thin. And also with a small fillet to it, so it is a bit more rounded and playful. Great, so that looks better already. We are also going to add some driveways to this to give it a bit more detail again. These are just some cubes again, but we're going to try to make sure it just lines up with the side of the road and is also just above the level of the floor. When that is done, it's also a good idea to actually make sure we are grouping all of this together, so the fences together and the driveways together. Maybe I should have done that before creating the driveways, because now it's just a bunch of cubes. Okay, next up let's create yet another detail, which will be some simplified trees. There is another video on this topic on the channel, where we model a low poly tree. So if you want some more advanced trees in your scene, you can go to that tutorial and place it inside of this scene. But for this tutorial, we will just create something very simple, which will be a pyramid shape. So let's scale it down, of course. And you can also stretch this up, so it is a bit more appropriate as a tree or a bush. And now it's just a matter of duplicating and scaling these to spice up your scene. You may be noticing I've kept this place empty, and that is because I want to create a lake on this place. So what we can do is going up here and pick the sketch tool. Let's go to the top view by clicking the mouse wheel button or checking this corner icon. So go in the top view. And you can just draw a random shape. Don't worry about these connections not being connected, because when you click on the spline, you should be able to enable this close spline option, and that way it's connected. But it is a bit sharp, so what we can do next is going up here and select the spline smooth tool. And now you can click and drag over this to give it a more smoothed look, but maybe it's a bit too smoothed. So let's undo that and make sure the strength is set to a lower value so it isn't as intense. Let's go back to the perspective mode and make sure the spline is above the floor. But now this is just a line and it's not a solid object, so we need to make this solid by going up here and creating a loft object and drag the spline inside of it. That way it's a solid object. So one more thing I would like to do now to finish off this model is creating some fluffy clouds above it. I think the easiest way to do this, to match the look of this all, is creating some spheres. So let's just ignore the size of this. And I'm going to create a duplicate on this side and make this like half the size of it and make sure it's close to it. And we're going to try to line up the bottom of the spheres. Let's also make a duplicate to the other side, and we're going to make this just a bit bigger. So like 2/3 of the original sphere. Okay, so when you have these, we're going to create a metaball object and drag these spheres inside of it. So you can see that there's something close to a cloud shape, but it's a bit rough. So let's go to the metaball settings and we're going to lower these editor subdivisions. You should be able to see something like 10 centimeters is just fine to get a smooth look. Also notice you can still adjust these spheres to get a different look. Of course we can scale this down now. And before making duplicates of this, I'm going to create a new camera object so I can see where these will be in our vision. Let's click on this button so we can see through the camera. And for this you could use the isometric perspective, but that will give you this angle and you cannot rotate the camera. So I actually prefer to use the parallel perspective. This way you can still rotate the view. So let's line this up so it fits the viewport. And now we can start creating some more clouds so we can see where they actually are. Also, this is a good time to show you this. If you're outside of the camera view, you can see this box which is representing the viewport where we are looking from, so what we can see when looking through the camera. So we need to make sure everything is inside of this box. So these clouds, if they are above this, you cannot see them. But if you move them inside of the box, you should be able to see them. So that's a good and easy way to make sure everything is inside of the view. Okay, so by doing that, I think we are finished with the actual modeling part of this tutorial. Let's move on to the colors for this. Of course, it's up to you what you do with this, but I will be quickly going over the colors I picked for this, so you can get the exact same result. Let's start off with the grass. You can see this is a green color, of course, but it is not very saturated. And that will be a recurring thing on all the other colors, because I like to keep everything a little more toned down, because that way we can go in the post-processing and Photoshop, for example, instead of having something way too bright in this scene. So let's drag that on the base shape, like this. Now we can create a second material for the road. So this will be some kind of gray, maybe add a hint of orange in it. And we're going to drag this on the object that represents the road, instead of dragging it on the whole base shape. Let's create the material for the lake. This will be a very soft blue. Really, you shouldn't make it too saturated for this one, because it will look a bit too dramatic. Next up, let's create a material for the trees. This is actually the same shade as the grass, but a bit darker. Also, because we grouped this all together, we can just drag the material on the group of the trees. Let's create the material for the fences. This will be some kind of light brown color, of course, which represents wood. And of course I also need to add the material of the roads to the driveways. Okay, so now we're at the point where it will be very useful that we used instances for these houses instead of making duplicates of it. So let's go to the original houses. And we are able to create a new material for the windows, for example. And we can just drag this on the group of cubes that are being cut out. But of course you can also see this is being applied to the door, so we need to make sure we find the door. Also, I'm not looking at the correct object. It should be below the surface. So let's select the door object, and we're going to create a new material for this, which will also be for some roofs. We're also going to create a material for the actual house. Drag that on the object. And now you can see we can drag the material of the door, for example, on this roof object. So that is one house. Let's create some alternative variations of these colors, so we have a bit more variation in this scene as well. Let's also create another color for the roof. Maybe something blue will look nice for this one. And I'm just going to repeat these steps for the other houses as well. So now we can go above the floor again and take a look at the result. So one more thing I notice is that we need a material for the clouds, which will be some kind of very light gray, but with a hint of blue in it. Let's take a look when we render this, how this looks. So that's really the basic way of showing this, because we still don't have any lighting on this, and of course that's a very necessary thing to do. Actually, this isn't something very hard to do. So what we're going to do is creating a physical sky, and in here at the time and location tab you can select anything you like. But for my preference I used something in the morning, so something like 1050 or 1040, and that way if you render you should be able to see where the shadows are going. And that is in the back direction, so it's all hidden behind the trees and behind the houses. And that's a bit of a shame, so what you can do is rotating the physical sky. That way the shadows will also be rotated. Now you saw it was not very impressive just yet, so what we're going to do is going in the render settings and add an ambient occlusion effect and also a global illumination effect. You can keep everything at default. So let's render once more to see what this looks like now. So now you can see this looks a lot better. I think it's still looking a bit dirty, or maybe more something like the fall or autumn than a spring scene. So let's go ahead and create a light object. And we're going to the bottom here in the settings and select the ambient illumination option. This way we have a bit more light in the whole scene, but at 100% intensity it is a bit too strong, so let's decrease this to something like 50%. Also, you noticed how the clouds are casting shadows on the floor, and in this case I think that is not looking very interesting, so let's go ahead and right click on the clouds group, go to Cinema 4D tags and create a compositing tag, and this way we can deselect the cast shadows option. We're also going to apply the same thing on this lake object, because you could see there was a very small shadow below the lake, and that is not very realistic of course, so let's do that. And let's try to make one last render to see if this looks alright now. And there you have it. Of course this was a quick version of what I actually made before recording this video, so if you want to download that one, it's also on the Patreon page. I hope you learned something new today, and I will see you in the next video.